Right, there was a conference in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, I believe it was in 1949. It was an amazing conference. It was a peace conference, the Waldorf Peace Conference, and Albert Einstein was there. And all kinds of Hollywood actors were there, and Aaron Copland, the musician, was there, and Lillian Hellman, the writer, was there. And all of them were saying that the Soviet Union was right and the United States was wrong. And it drove, this was the height of McCarthyism in the United States, and it drove the CIA and the FBI and all the American agencies, intelligence agencies, deep state, it drove them crazy. They said, how can all these smart people be defending the Soviet Union? How can this be happening? It drove them up the wall. They said, we've got to do something about this. And so the CIA launched what they call the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And you can Google that term, right? That's on CIA.gov. And they consider it to be one of their greatest achievements, which was to try and manipulate this intellectual milieu and pull them away from the Soviet Union. And they hired Sidney Hook, who was a New York City Trotskyite professor, and they hired him to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the CIA started funneling money to all kinds of artists and intellectuals and thinkers, and funneling the money, and they could talk about socialism. They had no problem with them talking about socialism. They had no problem with them criticizing Western society, but they had to be anti-communist. They had to be anti-Soviet while they did it. The CIA funded a magazine called Partisan Review, right? The Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was a Trotskyite magazine, and it was very anti-capitalist, critical of capitalism, critical of the Western system, but always anti-Soviet as well, right? The CIA funded art galleries by Jackson Pollock, right? Jackson Pollock is famous for, throwing paint on the canvas, right? And they said, look at this, in the socialist countries, they just have socialist propaganda everywhere, but look how the West is beautiful. They've got Jackson Pollock who's just throwing art on the canvas. Isn't that beautiful? And the CIA made it their project to try and divide these two camps of people who become socialists. Take that revolutionary intelligentsia and get them to be further and further away from the socialist countries and further away from the working class who might become attracted to socialism in the time of a crisis. And it wasn't just art galleries, and it wasn't just Trotskyite magazines. The CIA had another program that they call MK Ultra. Are folks familiar with MK Ultra? And this was the distribution of narcotics and drugs. The CIA went out of its way to begin distributing drugs and narcotics all across college campuses. Now, I know Harvard is near here. Harvard University, I believe, is somewhere near here, right? It's a couple blocks. There was a professor there by the name of Timothy Leary. And in the 1960s, Dr. Timothy Leary, with lots of funding, started going around the United States encouraging young people who were protesting the Vietnam War and protesting for civil rights to use LSD and to use drugs. And he had this slogan, tune in, turn on, drop out. And millions of dollars was poured into this project of getting people in the United States who might become socialists and communists, who were critical of the system, to start using drugs. And the socialist movement, historically, has been one of the most anti-drug things in history. I mean, one of the first things after the Chinese Revolution, they executed the heroin importers. There was always a feeling that drug addiction and narcotics addiction was something that the socialist movement was trying to cure society of. Right? It was an ill of capitalism, where people are turned into addicts that are ruthlessly exploited and worked to death and giving every last cent they have, and that drug addiction is something that the revolutionary movement was trying to cure. But, lo and behold, starting in the 1960s, suddenly if you went into socialist and left circles, we all had to get high, man. It was the thing to do. And another thing that happened during this time was the rise of the Eastern cults. It's very interesting. The Hare Krishna movement, for example. In India, if you go to India, you talk to communists in India, which I have, they're considered in India to be one of the most right-wing movements that they are. They're Hindu nationalists. They want to restore very traditional, conservative things in India. However, in the United States, if you go to left-wing marches and peace rallies, there's the Hare Krishna movement. And look at them, they're Eastern men, they're wearing their orange robes, and you suddenly saw Eastern mysticism and things like that accepted in left circles. Another example is the Dalai Lama. The feudal kingdom that existed in Tibet was something that was deeply admired by Nazi Germany. So much to the point that this book that is widely promoted in left liberal circles now, 7 Years in Tibet, the author of it is Heinrich Harrer. And Heinrich Harrer was a member of Hitler's SS. He was actually, that's why he was in Tibet and had the opportunity to so closely observe feudal Tibet. And that Julius Evola, another thinker who was associated with Italian fascism, was just blown away by how authoritarian and strict Tibetan society was. And he was saying to the Europeans, this is what we need to recreate it. In fact, one of the reasons the Nazis adopted the swastika as their symbol was because the Nazis really admired the caste system of India. Because they said, look, there's no strikes and protests or anything. Everyone's just born into their caste. It's perfect. This is the ancient traditional way. It was always understood in Europe prior to the Second World War, the mainstream viewpoint was Christianity. That was the mainstream viewpoint. Most people were Christians. The left promoted science and dialectical materialism, and it was the extreme right and the fascists that tended to promote Eastern mysticism and the occult and that kind of thing. But after the Second World War, all of a sudden in left-wing circles, Eastern mysticism and the occult, along with the drugs, along with the anti-Soviet stuff, suddenly flows into left circles. And you have a lot of foundations that are funding this kind of thing. And this didn't just have an impact in the United States. Now, I often get eye rolls when I mention the name George Soros. People think, oh God, he's Tucker Carlson here, Bill O'Reilly here, Glenn Beck, it's all George Soros. Who is George Soros? Well, George Soros is a Hungarian billionaire who basically started funneling money in the 80s, 70s to dissident movements within the Eastern Bloc. People in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania and the Soviet Union who were upset with the socialist system that existed. And their grievances were very real, okay? There were a lot of people that were college professors, engineers, scientists who felt stifled by the socialist system. They felt like they didn't have the ability to put their ideas into practice. They felt like they weren't free to make the kind of movies that they wanted. They had some legit grievances. If I was in their shoes, I'm sure I would have been mad about it also. The overwhelming majority of the population did not share their grievances, but this intellectual strata within the Eastern Bloc had some legit concerns. And George Soros figured out how to funnel money into the Eastern Bloc in order to manipulate those grievances. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, that's another name that, again, you get eye rolls. You watch Morning Joe, Mika Brzezinski, that's her father. So, this is not a non-influential person, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski also started figuring out how to manipulate these folks and staging uprisings. And if you look at these uprisings that happened across Eastern Europe in the 1960s, 70s, up until the crisis and the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, if you look at it, a lot of these people didn't even know what they were protesting. A lot of them said that they liked socialism. They're like, I like socialism. I just want to be able to shop at Walmart. I just want to be able to make whatever kind of movie. I want to keep my guaranteed job. I want to keep my guaranteed health care. I want to keep all the benefits of the socialist system. But I have my grievance and I'm going to pour into the streets. They didn't even realize they were being manipulated. And that's why when you go to any formerly socialist country throughout Eastern Europe, every poll overwhelmingly shows people say life was so much better before the fall of the Soviet Union, before the fall of the Eastern Bloc. Whether it's Romania, Czechoslovakia, people say we didn't know what we had. In all of these countries, the overwhelming majority of the population voted in polls and referendums to keep the socialist system. But there were people within the governments who had been compromised. There was this intellectual strata, this milieu that was protesting and had their legitimate grievances. And the West and the CIA and British intelligence and others were able to manipulate that discontent and that crisis to bring down socialism across Eastern Europe. There's all this talk, oh, under socialism everyone starved. Look at what happened in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union after the fall of socialism, when capitalism was imposed on those countries. It was an epic disaster. People lost their life savings, right? People who had never had to worry about being unemployed in their entire lives were suddenly starving, right? One statistic shows that the population of Russia actually decreased by roughly 10% during the 1990s. Now, it wasn't just people dying, it was also people just fleeing because there was nothing there economically. There had been, maybe some level of drug addiction prior to the fall of the Soviet Union. The heroin epidemic in Russia and in Eastern Europe was massive in the 1990s. The suicide rate was massive. Sex trafficking, right? Eastern Europe became the sex trafficking capital of the world. All these women that had had guaranteed jobs and guaranteed maternity leave before were suddenly being sold into sexual slavery all over the world. The overthrow of socialism in Eastern Europe and neoliberal economics, it was one of the biggest humanitarian disasters we've ever seen. People were dying and starving and suffering. And it was that disaster that kind of paved the way for the situation that we're now in the world.